Welcome to Founders Unplugged, hosted by Greg Mccallum. Long-form, honest conversations with founders and entrepreneurs from around the world.
Hi, I'm Alex Neill. I'm the co-founder of Consumer Voice. We set up our business in 2023 and we're on a mission to help consumers get back money from rule-breaking companies.
Great introduction. Thank you. So
Mid-vape, sorry.
Yeah. It's fine. It's usually people that take a little bit more time. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to have an opportunity to drink my tea and let you introduce yourself. But that was very concise. So well done. Thank you for joining. We were just saying before we click record, it's kind of felt like it was ages ago that we booked this in. And yet it's like, it's here really quickly. But it's good to finally have the opportunity to sit down and chat. We met, it was a Brighton Angels Roadshow.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
me and my business partner Nikki were pitching at one of their roadshow events. So yeah, that's when we met.
Yeah. So tell me what's been going on since then.
Well, it's been a busy sort of probably 6 months since then. So we've been really busy in terms of growing our consumer audience. So we've had sort of more than 2 million impressions on the site since then, over 200,000 visits. We've got 22,000 people in our email community, which is really our kind of powerhouse really of the business. That's what we're looking to grow. So Our business is an online website for consumers that talks about, I guess, from big and small, ways to get back your money, whether that's about a faulty product or a problem with a car loan that you've had. We provide free tools and templates for people to do complaint letters and complain about things. But then we also write up to the big stuff, which, is about big group litigation, big group actions, which is quite new for the UK. It came in the Consumer Rights Act in 2015, but it's really only started to sort of gather pace in the last few years. So we're really trying to bridge that gap, I guess, between, sort of people, getting ripped off for very small things right up to kind of everyday, quite big products and services. And I suppose that bridge between speaking to scary lawyers who actually run these big legal actions and us being able to kind of explain to people what they're all about and how they get involved.
Yeah, the whole class action thing, it was always something that I'd associated with the States, right? They love a good class action out there. But it's being imported in, isn't it? Just like everything else from the States, I guess.
Yeah, and it's very different. It is very different. I mean, over there it is massive. It's well established, and it's been around for a very long time, and it's for pretty much everything. So the way that these actions run in the States is that they're brought on behalf of a group of people, but it could be for any sort of consumer problem, any big sort of issues and competition issues as well. Whereas in the UK, it's much narrower. So, the ability for those claims to be brought on behalf of people is only for competition breaches. So if a company has acted in a way, if it's acted as part of a cartel, if it's acted as in a way that breaches competition law, then a claim can be brought on behalf of groups of people. And there's about 35 of those claims now at the competition court. But otherwise, what has existed for years and years and years in the UK is what's called a group litigation order, where people join a claim proactively at the start, then it gets filed at the court, and all of those claims get heard as a group as long as they're similar enough. And that can be then across a number of different areas. That's much broader. But the mechanism's slightly more tricky to use and more costly, which is kind of one of the reasons why we actually set up Consumer Voice, because I suppose this whole area of class actions in group actions is not well known. And the problem that the lawyers are sort of facing is to bring claims, and there's lots of, really kind of meritorious claims that could be brought, but the cost of doing them is so huge because to get consumers engaged, it's costing quite a lot of money at the moment. So we really wanted to kind of step in there, educate consumers about what these class actions are, what they need to consider before they join them, and also then start to spread awareness of them. At the moment, we did some research before we set up the business. So we spent about 4 or 5 months kind of researching this whole area. We obviously knew about it. I say obviously, we knew about it because Nikki, my business partner, and I have spent more than a decade at the Consumer Champion Witch. So we've worked in consumer advocacy for for longer than we'd care to admit between us. So we have a long history in these sorts of areas. And I mentioned the Consumer Rights Act. I actually, when I was at Which, was leading the kind of lobbying efforts to actually bring in the part of the Consumer Rights Act that enables the big opt-out claims. So I've always had a real interest in it, and I've been kind of watching it. And when I left Which around 2019, I actually thought about setting up something similar to what we're doing right now. But I was probably thinking more sort of consultancy type business, but it was just too early. So I did a bit of scouting around, and the regime was really nascent. There weren't really loads of claims, so it just, my sort of take on it was, it's just not the right time. And then sort of in 2022, Nikki and I started talking about sort of various things. I'm involved in leading a claim against Sony PlayStation, and we started to sort of relook at the world and engage with the law firms, think about, what the different consumer advocacy bodies were doing, and then actually do some research with consumers. And it's then we sort of felt that, the world was ready for consumer voice finally, and we gave it a name, and it became actually much more than we originally were thinking. Again, was thinking about, look, we could support law firms with consumer engagement, whether that's about email comms programs, best practice in sort of, PR and comms and research. But as we started to talk to more firms, we were kind of saying, actually, there's something bigger here. And hang on a minute, we've spent, between us sort of nearly sort of 20 odd years in content, running content publishing businesses and building communities. So that's exactly what's needed here. There's nobody doing what we're doing. So nobody's got a website dedicated to group actions, and nobody sort of trying to organise building a community around mobilising people to get back what they're owed. I mean, ultimately, there's kind of lots of interest groups in terms of, there's a group representing the lawyers in this area, there's a group representing people who fund the claims, but there was nobody kind of really representing, consumers and thinking about, as this regime grows and sets up, what does good look like, and how should these claims run? So even though, sort of 4 years had moved on between when I was first sort of thinking about it to now, it's still in a kind of shaping phase. So we've still got a great opportunity to both sort of grow a business, but also shape a market. For us, that's really exciting. I think for me, really thinking about, our business is very purpose driven. So we really want to see, we want this regime to work, but we want it to work in the right way for consumers, because ultimately, the criticism, as you sort of said, is that kind of, we don't want the American system. There's lots of people lobbying very, very hard in big businesses right across the country at the moment, to get rid of these big class actions, that companies don't want them, funnily enough. And, we've also got a part to play in making sure that the regime does work well, does ensure that people who are affected by these big issues do get the money, that it's, and, the criticism being, oh, it's just about lawyers and funders making money, So I guess we also felt like somebody needed to be there to make sure that consumers do step forward and get their compensation. But they can only do that if they know about it. So we did some research, and the horrible stat is, although £120 billion is currently on the table for UK consumers from these class actions, that's if they're all won, 74% of people had never even heard of them. So, the really, really big ones, they had no clue that they were happening. There's quite a job for us to do to sort of switch people on to, just understanding what's happening here, and then actually take that step of engaging.
I guess it is a fine balance, because like you were saying about the sort of American side of it and the pushback from companies and stuff, it is a fine balance between wanting a legal system in especially within the consumer space that yes, is obviously very focused on protecting consumers and having mechanisms in place that they can come together and fight these battles and win them, and do it in a way that doesn't sort of doesn't make it only available to people who have the money and all that sort of stuff. That's really important. But at the same time, we need to make sure, I guess, on the flip side, that companies are protected from predatory approaches from maybe slightly predatory law firms or bad practices there, or because of course businesses do make mistakes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're fraudulent, or that they're that their entire aim was to maybe take take people's money or deliver a bad service or whatever. But of course, these suits, from my understanding of them anyway, can destroy some companies. At certain sizes, it can completely cripple them. Not some of the larger ones, but so I suppose it is about finding the right balance. And I'm quite proud of the British justice system. It's not a perfect justice system, but we have been relatively good, I think, at seeing some of the practices of around the world that are a little bit sort of, I don't know what's the word, commercializing of the law. Let's just say.
Sharp. Yeah. Another set of sharp practices, but in another way.
Yeah, but we've been quite good at keeping it fairly grounded, I think, in the UK for the best part. Like, we don't allow, we haven't turned court into television shows. We haven't, like, you know what I mean? We're quite traditionalist in that sense, and we take the law relatively seriously. And it's good to see, and I hope that it stays that way to a degree. But I also get that you have to catch up with the times. And one thing that the UK is slightly bad at is doing that because of the traditionalist values in some of these institutions. So it's a very fine balance, isn't it?
It is. And I think, there definitely are some things that we also felt from a consumer perspective where, there is a lack of trust in some of the characters that are involved in the kind of legal system, whether that's around claims management companies, for example. So one of the reasons that we sort of wanted to set up Consumer Voice was because it felt like it lacked that, well, frankly, that kind of more consumer advocacy education style voice in there, that otherwise there's law firms doing law things, and then they use, kind of claims management companies or generators to talk to consumers, but that is being done often. I mean, we'll have all seen it. As soon as you click on one of the kind of little adverts on Facebook, you're suddenly sort of inundated with lots of, these same ones with messages just about money, just about you could get this money, you could get this money. And I think for us, again, one of the things that we try and differentiate on is what is the harm that the claim is addressing.
Hi. A friendly reminder to share this episode with your network, like, and subscribe. And if you are feeling really supportive, please consider reviewing the show on the podcast platform of your choice. It all really helps support what we do. Thank you. Now back to the show.
What has the company allegedly done? And then obviously, from your perspective, what do I stand to gain is an important message. But we always lead with, what is the harm? What has the company done to break the rules? And then what's the payoff for you ultimately? And the reason that we do that is not just because we think that's a nice thing to do and the right thing, but also because when we spoke to consumers about their motivations for joining any claims, it is very different to other countries. Now, in the US, and actually I was talking to somebody the other day who's sort of out in the Netherlands, and they were saying, look, what works over here is just pound signs, talk about money, talk about compensation, and that's the lead. And it's all driven by, it's got to be hundreds of pounds. And we spoke to lots of lawyers here who were saying, part of the kind of way that these cases are constructed is around the financials and what the payoff is. And part of it is also, so very small cases against defendants that can't pay don't happen, to be honest, Greg, because nobody would get any money back from that. So, the solvency or not of the company and their ability to pay is part of the sort of, considerations there as well. But one of the things that we were sort of concerned about is that there are some really worthy cases where the compensation might be quite low, but the issue is really needs tackling. And a lot of firms were saying, well, that won't really work because people won't join a claim if it's less than sort of 200 quid. And I was kind of saying, from coming from a consumer advocacy background, I said, I've got people to do quite complicated actions, writing to CEOs of companies, MPs, doing various sort of, forward actions from that for nothing. They're not getting anything apart from solving problems, righting wrongs. So, we were kind of saying, well, let's test that. So we spoke to, again, a sort of big group of consumers about, look, what would your real motivations be? Why would you get involved? And they all consistently say, and it's something that we test still in the business now. So if you join our community, we ask you those questions around what are your motivations? Why are you here? And people always say, look, I want to right wrongs. I want to stop, I want to stop bad behavior. And yeah, I wouldn't mind. Second answer, yeah, I would like to get some compensation as well. So I think it's a little bit about our kind of pitch is slightly different, purposefully.
Is that a
on that way
cultural
as
thing in the
well.
UK as well? Do you think that culturally in the UK we're a little bit more concerned about
Yeah.
justice and rule of law, and sort of ethics maybe over
Shy complainers. We're very shy complainers.
right?
Brits love to complain to each other.
Yeah,
Oh, this food was dreadful. God, wasn't it really awful? How was your meal? Lovely, thank you.
yeah.
It's 100% that. So there
Yeah.
is also a kind of look what people will state, which is, oh yes, I'm here for all the altruism and I really want to stop things. But there is, below that, okay, and I would like to get that money back as well. And I think that the two are connected for me too, which is also, look, one of the issues about we've got a great legal system, we've got a great set of, enforcement and a set of rules for companies to follow, both legal and then often regulatory. But the issues with some of that are that, there's a big stick from a regulator, for example, and they can say, don't do that again, company, and here's a fine, or, we've written to you and we've told everyone we've written to you, or all of those sorts of things where they'll warn companies and try and change practice like that. But that doesn't, what they can't do is put money back into people's pockets. So if something has directly harmed the consumer, sometimes they can make agreements with the firm but that all has to be agreed by the company. They can't just force a compensation regime unless it's a very specific sort of set of circumstances. So that is what this whole regime was for, was to say, well, if the harm was to an individual, and, to your earlier point about spurious claims or cases, it's just not really possible, because the way that those claims sort of generally come about is they are worked up, and to get funding, if somebody's going to back something to the tune of 10 million quid over 5 years, they are going to kick the tires on whether they think that's winnable, and whether you've got a claim there and whether that will really happen. So there's quite a lot of checks and balances beforehand. And then obviously the court themselves, it's a very high bar to get a claim in, that they will look at both the kind of setup of the claim and the funding and how that all looks, but then they'll also look at, does it meet the kind of threshold to even be looked at by the court? So, it's quite a long process, which again is difficult for consumers, because you'll be talking to them about something and then you've got to kind of take them on a bit of a journey to what can sometimes be 2 years, or it could be 5 years. In the big sort of opt-out claims, those claims are taking a number of years. We've only just had the first trial and conclusion of that trial, which is a claim against BT, which actually was lost, and that's being appealed, or hopefully appealed at the moment. So far there's been one full trial, and there's been 2 settlements agreed. So that's from something that was introduced in 2015. I think there was quite a number of years where there wasn't many claims filed, and then there was an explosion of cases filed sort of about 2 years ago, where there was more claims filed in the 1 year than there had been in the previous 7. So it's definitely sort of picking up interest.
I mean, it is one of the double-edged sword aspects of law is the time that it can take to process in all sides of the law. There is a strange amount of comfort that I get from knowing that these things take time, which is that you would assume that because of that, I's are dotted and T's are crossed, for both sides. At the end of the day, these are important things, whether there's, criminality involved or a lot of money involved, whatever it is, these things have to be done properly. It's where things are dragged out unnecessarily. That's a bit of a different scale, or where people use various systems within the legal system to kind of slow things down intentionally. But again, if you don't feel like you've got enough time to prepare, then that can be useful. So nothing's ever perfect, I guess. But I wanted to ask you about about these ads that I keep seeing all over the place, because I imagine that you probably get a little bit frustrated with some of the stuff that you see online too, because of how it kind of it sort of makes people perceive what you do. because there are a lot of organizations out there that I see sort of putting Facebook ads and, TikTok ads or whatever, like say, well, I mean, like we can go back to even, before the age of social media, and you'd still see posters up in hospitals saying, have you been in an accident that wasn't your fault? And now we still see that now and on daytime TV and stuff like that. So, okay, I get that there are probably some legitimate companies there, but it seems to be more prevalent than ever. People saying, you may have been missold this. Did you take a car loan out in the last however many years? You may have missold that. And there's so much of it. It genuinely looks, I don't know for sure, but it looks like a lot of it is a scam. Like, am I right in thinking that?
Well, I think they're often not. They're often not, I would say, but I think you hit the nail on the head with that's what consumers think. So part of, I guess, and I think part of that is also the sort of probably maybe a bit of growing pains in this sector where, right, the reason why the ads looked the way they looked was because they worked, so the triple fall stuff, which is the kind of individual claim stuff that we don't do. But the reason they did it was because it did get people to make claims. But I think now the world has moved on, and actually people do start to look at that whole, you just see a really simple thing saying something you've never heard of or never thought was a problem, you're going to be owed 300 quid. I think most of us look at it and go, well, that's not me. So actually, I think those things are sort of seen as scams, and you do see that on people posting that on the bottom of a lot of the ads. This is a scam, or people are trying to get your data, or this is not real. So actually, I think there's part of the reason, again, we set up was when we talked to consumers, we showed consumers sort of various ads, and they talked about it in exactly the same terms as you, as I'm not sure if this is a bit scammy, it feels like it's an overblown kind of issue, it's not really an issue, like what is this all about? So again, for us, part of our sort of pitch is that let's root this in the problem so that people can start to discover it in a slightly more, say, educational, because that sounds really boring, but like,
no, but I think
in
I know
a
what you
kind
mean.
of
More of a content marketing sort of approach of like, did you know that
editorial,
right, yeah, like getting someone who's actually been a victim of something, or and sort of getting them to talk about it, as opposed to just a graphic that says you could be owed compensation. Like,
yeah. And I think, a lot of those things are kind of trying to grab people's attention and pull them in. But then if what they're pulling them into
but I also think
still
it's predatory
doesn't,
in a way, because it is preying on people's vulnerability, which is maybe the fact that they might need money, or that they're looking for ways to find money. I think that's the issue, that we're sort of pre-programmed for that, especially in the digital age where we get 1,000 emails a day trying to sell us, peanuts enlargement pills, a prince in whatever African country, wants to give us money, like all this kind of stuff. Like we are getting a little bit more mature when it comes to these things. And so I think our radar for bullshit, frankly, is kind of on high alert when it comes to our experience in the digital world.
I think you have to be really careful as well, like you say, because actually some of the claims could look, as you say, as though you're being misleading or other. And, and I think you're then sort of falling into the territory of actually perpetuating some of the things that you're actually trying to stop. So, if you think way back when, when Which was first set up, 60 years ago, the big problem it was trying to solve was, problems with defective products and unsafe products. Now, largely thanks to the kind of progression of consumer rights and product safety laws, that problem doesn't really exist in the same way. Like, we have seat belts, we don't have lead paint in, children's toys, etc., etc., and the safety regime is pretty good, although there are some clear exceptions to that. But the big problem I think that we're trying to solve now is around misleading claims. It is about misinformation, and it is about those kind of illegal practices that are often perpetuated online by online businesses. So I think, again, you have to be quite careful when you're marketing in this area, that, as you say, we try and lead with great content and editorial that fully explains to people what the issue is, why it's a problem, if you might be affected, what you need to do, and what the process really is. Because I think a lot of people as well, one of the reasons why it costs so much and law firms, spend so much money acquiring customers into claims is because they don't really know what they've got themselves into. Because of that pull through social media, they didn't really understand. It's often not by the law firm, because who knows the names of the law firms? So it's, a kind of brand name made up for that claim. So they didn't really understand the journey that they went through. And then they might go and join.
That in itself feels fishy. Like, so I mean,
Yeah,
these guys are not doing themselves any favors. It's like, if just put yourself out and be honest, be transparent about that. Like, why would you create, you know what I mean? That's just odd practice.
Yeah, and I guess part of that as well is because they're law firms, they're lawyers, they don't have that kind of comms and marketing DNA background, that kind of consumer engagement background. So, one of the great things that when we've talked to them is, that's sort of hand that over to us. That's what we do. That's what we spent our careers doing. Like, I'm not a lawyer. I did a law degree, never practiced, but, so I can kind of talk your language, but, wouldn't go much further than that. But what, we've spent decades doing that, and there is a real skill to it. But as I say, I think, we just felt that doesn't exist at the moment. There isn't anyone else doing it in the UK. There isn't really anyone else doing it in any other country, actually, because of the way in the US there's something similar, but it's much more kind of like it's not a community, it's not education, it's just kind of functional. Here are the things, join them. There's loads of them. They're for everything. Whereas
more of a self-running machine kind of there.
Yeah, exactly.
But I just think the industry needs to be careful by the sound of it, because like I said, if the main perception from the general public is this kind of this skepticism, let's just say, on the, being generous, then it may be that that industry itself has to end up being forced into reforms from customer complaints. Like,
yeah,
it may end up being a victim of its own practices in some way, where it's like, maybe there's going to be some advertising standards forced on it to say, look, we get that you're a legitimate organization, legitimate industry or whatever.
Yeah.
Whenever you have claims like this, then you're going to have to follow these guidelines from an advertising perspective, maybe. And I think it would be a bad thing.
They would all have to. They all definitely do now, and there are
plenty of laws around that already. But it might be that there's some extra sort of tightening on that, perhaps, and that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I think if there was some laws around it that kind of said you can't just you can't just create an account with a random like you said, like a random name. You have to make very clear that it is your law firm or something, like maybe. Like, for number one, that would be a good thing for them, I think, from a transparency perspective. But then also number two, like, maybe it has to be expressed through someone that has experienced that problem. If you're going to, I don't know. Do you know what I mean? I'm just sort of thinking outside the box.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are definite
talking about the claim.
Yeah,
maybe.
There are definite rules, around that, and obviously, at the bottom of the footer and all of that, it will say who the firm is, but who looks at all of that? I mean, I think for me,
Rev Ops leaders, let's be real. You can't optimize what you can't measure. You've got the dashboards, the pipeline data, the forecasts, but what about your sales team's actual skills? That's where Peer, today's sponsor and my startup shamelessly, comes in. Peer runs remote, expert-led sales skills audits. Think of it like a MOT for your revenue team. Instead of guessing who needs coaching or relying on lagging performance data, Peer proactively identifies strengths, skill gaps, and hidden risks before they impact revenue. The best RevOps teams run these audits regularly, creating a structured AI-ready data set that powers smarter hiring, sharper enablement, and faster revenue growth. The best part? You can get started with a free discovery audit plus 20% off your first full audit today. Just click the link in the show notes or use the QR code on screen, and you can start making data-driven sales decisions today. Now, back to the episode.
I think for me, it's more about, those practices will change. The advent of people like us coming in to show how to do it better, but also because success will be in a different way as well. As you say, people will stop clicking those things. I think the other thing is that people will, one of the other big areas for the regime is it also needs to start to work. People need to see proof of bad behavior being stopped and payouts being made. So, there's sort of evidence of that in terms of there was a, kind of big settlement If you think of the big diesel claims actually that have been around, actually there's been one large settlement there from a manufacturer, and there's sort of about 10
So
manufacturers
is
going
that
through the
legit? Because
courts
I
now.
remember seeing loads of stuff about that. Was that actually legitimate? Because I
Yeah,
had a diesel
yeah.
vehicle, and was getting bombarded with if you had a diesel vehicle between these. What was that all about?
It,
I didn't understand it.
yeah, it is. It's all about basically manufacturers for a number of years. And I remember this from the days at Which, when we tested cars, and we always used to say about this, where effectively, there were sort of fixes made to kind of, I mean, not this is not the legal definition, but effectively they rigged the tests so that they passed the kind of emissions tests when the cars actually didn't. So people overpaid for diesels on the basis of they reached a particular set of performance criteria that they actually wouldn't if they'd not made these fixes into the car. And it was right across the sector and the industry, and they have been settling all over the world. So yeah, the big car manufacturers have made massive sort of settlements, or are going through the courts right now on that. There will be payouts to people, and there have been, and there will continue to be. That is, at the moment, there's, as I say, there's probably 10 manufacturers that are going through the UK courts, but and they'll continue to do so. But yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Like you say, on the basis of,
I mean, again, I thought that was absolute bullshit.
Yeah,
I genuinely,
is that real?
until this conversation right now, I thought that was absolute bullshit. And one of the main reasons was for that one, I don't see it now that much, but I saw a lot of content creators talking about it. So, well, I mean, these were clearly paid for, but like there were a lot of people. So it was like, teenagers and stuff going, have you owned a diesel vehicle? You'll never guess what, you could be owed some money. And that's just like, guys, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
You're still at school. And they were clearly paid by, by some agencies or whatever to do these campaigns. That's not helping.
I think you hit on a really interesting point as well, though, that when people don't explain, I think if you never knew and you were kind of like, a lot of people will say, oh, I really like my X, whatever it is. I liked my diesel car. I like my, Apple phone. I like my, and I like this brand. And I think for consumers, there is a sort of confusion at times with, I really like this product, so of course they've never done anything wrong, versus, no, actually. And often we're dealing with issues in these areas that are hidden. So, if it was in plain sight and you could see, oh yeah, this kettle doesn't work, like, off everybody would go, taking it back to wherever they bought it from, and they would suddenly think, I probably should recall them or whatever. But I think with these issues, it's a lot harder for people, rightly, to kind of understand, well, what you're talking about.
Well, why would you care? I mean, that's the other thing as well.
Or people don't like to feel as well like they've done something stupid, made a bad choice, or so.
I think it might be another deeper psychological thing too, where, like, to some extent, I felt like when I've seen those ads, whether it's to do with the diesel one or more so to do with the car finance one, funnily enough, I feel like it's trying to manipulate me to be upset about something that I otherwise wouldn't be upset about. That's the issue I have with it. It's like you're trying to rile me up, and make an enemy out of these businesses that I don't feel either way about. Like, I don't care. Like, and so I think that's the issue for me. And that's just my own personal, obviously, feeling about it. But it's like it feels like the equivalent to me of, a friend coming up to me and trying to badmouth someone that I know, not necessarily a friend or just an acquaintance. I'm like, dude, stop trying to stir shit up. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't matter. Okay, this person's nicked the sandwich out of the fridge a few times in a row. Okay, they shouldn't have done that, but it doesn't really affect me. It hasn't. Or it's gone. What? Let bygones be gone. That's a bit of it. I think that I'm feeling a bit icky about with some of this.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It feels a little.
It's very polarizing, isn't it? Whereas some people will be like, oh my God, I'm with you, sandwich man. Like, I've noticed it and I'm really angry about it too. So it does activate some people, whereas other people just say,
if there was a company that had been, I don't know, putting chemicals in stuff that turns out they were carcinogenic, and that, that certain, I don't know, kids are growing an additional set of toes, or, something like that, I'm like, all right, let's do something about that. Like,
So there are
I
definitely
don't
going to be
know.
horses for courses, like you're saying, claims for different people. And that's why
Yeah.
I think it's about also treating people as grown-ups and saying, look, this is what the issue is. And
If you
if you want to get
if you
on
want to get
board,
involved, get involved. Right. Yeah.
get involved. And if you
Mm.
don't, fine. You know, like you're never going to get 100% of people who say, yeah, I'm completely with you.
But it's
I
but
think
it's a
though,
really interesting line to toe, because of obviously, like you were saying, that the approach has to be educational. But then what you don't want to do is cross that line over into potentially manipulative. But of course,
yeah,
the whole, the whole point of putting together a good narrative is that you want to make people feel something. So it's a very
yeah.
difficult line to
And
cross.
yeah, exactly. And if you pitch it sort of, I think all of that will, like you say, is definitely, it'll evolve as well as to
Mm.
what works. So I
Yeah.
think, as people become more sophisticated, which I think people are, which is what you're sort of reflecting now, which is this whole, oh, is this all a bit scammy, or also is it all just too hyped, which I think again is
And that
the
feeling like that
world's
we're quite
the
conscious of
world's
the feeling that we're being manipulated by media, I
yeah,
think. Yeah.
yeah. I think that's a lot of people are in that place as well,
Mm.
which is why, again, I think a lot of things now move to look. This is what the problem is, and these are the ways that it's affected these sorts of people. It may be you, or it may not be you. Find out or don't. That, I mean, I think, like you say, the car finance one is really interesting that you've raised, in that actually there's some really, really shady things that have been going on there, and I think, but it's also not right to say that every car loan will have been missold. That's just not the case. There's plenty of people who clearly have been doing it right, but there are plenty of bad practices that were going on. So things like, car dealers adjusting so that you come in, the minimum that the rate you're paying on a loan is nothing to do with your credit history. It's all just based on, they found out from you as they've talked to you how much you can afford, and then moved the interest rate up and then pitched it to you, because in the background, the more interest you pay, the more commission they get paid. So things like that I just think are wrong, and people didn't realize that was happening. You perhaps might have said, hey, I don't want to pay extra interest just because I could afford it. I thought I was paying a credit rating version of my interest. So there's things like that. Or there's all sorts of things that have gone on where, even down to, I found this out the other day, that some car lenders were actually buy physical stock for dealers to sell, so that then when they sell those cars, it has to be their loan that they'd sell. Now, I just think there's all these things going on where, okay, if it was a straight commission and it was just like, look, a bit like with a mortgage broker says to you, I'm going to earn commission on arranging your mortgage, and that's not tied to any product, but I will make this amount of money. Or they say, on these particular products, I make £150 every time you arrange it. And you can go, yeah, cool. Okay, yeah, you've done me a service. I accept that. We move on. But I think part of it has been there that it's all been happening in the background. There's big money at stake. I mean, ultimately, kind of what we've learned is that car dealers make more money on arranging finance than they do on the car. And I think
Yeah. Yeah.
for consumers, that's been the big, like when we talk to them about
That's
it, I
the
think you're right.
opening thing.
A lot of
Mm.
people sit there kind of going, I just wanted my car finance, and it's totally fine and enabled to me. I've used car finance,
Mm.
but I sort of think again when I think, oh God, right, there's definitely more going on there than people think. And I think that we've had some really interesting comments back from people to say, ranging from the I just really don't like this practice, right to, look, I accept that someone could get a commission, but I should be told about it and I should understand how much it's been, because that's the
Right.
other bit.
So
If it was
they
150
felt like
quid,
they were duped, and there wasn't
yeah, I mean,
transparency.
some people have actually, the dealers have made as much commission as the loan has been for. There's some crazy stuff going on. So I think back to the point though, a blunt message saying all car dealers are doing this, everyone's ripped off, but it's not true. But also it doesn't help, because I actually think using the examples to say, look, these sorts of things have been happening. Did you realise? Does it matter to you? If it doesn't,
Yeah.
Off you go.
It's
There
how
are
you construct
certain
the
people who
message
say,
and deliver it, and also who's delivering it. I think that's important too. I think that,
yeah,
because like I said,
and
you don't.
what's
If any of these law firms are listening, don't get teenage TikTokers to deliver your message just because of they have influence or an audience. I mean,
yeah,
for Christ's sake, what are you doing? Know your audience first of all. That isn't your audience, probably. So that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, some arrogant prick of a teenager who's never worked a day in his life because he's become TikTok famous. Like, I'm not going, as someone in the demographic, like, I'm not going to
yeah,
trust that person.
yeah,
you know
yeah.
Unfortunately,
Well,
put someone a little bit who looks and acts a little bit like me, and that's like marketing 101.
well, that's it. And the other thing is, it's kind of people, they sort of want to go, well, what do you want to happen? Because I think that's the last piece that we haven't really talked about. But it's like, some people will say, but I wouldn't have really done anything different because, I wanted my car, I needed a loan. So what?
If you are enjoying this episode and want to support the show, please like, subscribe with notifications turned on, and let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. This lets YouTube know we are doing something right. Back to the show.
Well, what they should have done is simply just tell you so that you could
Right.
decide, because this is a particularly interesting market as well, because everyone talks about switching all the time in consumer markets, which is sort of really dull, and it's the kind of card that everybody uses. Oh, don't worry, everyone can switch, but everyone could go somewhere else. But we know in this market, again, we just did a survey with 2,000 consumers on this, and only 4% of people walked away from a dealership and went and did their own research on getting finance, because people just are not in that mindset.
But yeah,
that's why it's really important that people at least be upfront with like what's going on.
Yeah, but that's another really good point, which is, I think, another part of me, aside from the sort of the maybe feeling manipulated bit and all the stuff that we talked about, another part of me is also just of the sort of the opinion that, like, I've got enough going on. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't have the bandwidth to care about this issue. I just don't. Like, maybe some people do. I'm of the suspicion that perhaps, I would hope, in some ways, ironically, maybe not for you guys, but I would hope that people's lives are kind of full enough and that they're busy enough that there isn't bandwidth for something like this. In the same way that, I guess, during the time where they may have fell victim to to your point, to the actual situation that maybe that's exactly what these people are relying on, that these companies are relying on, that they're not going to look to switch, they're not going to look at their options because people's lives are busy. This is just one of a thing in the list of to-dos that day, which is, get the car sorted, get the, whatever. And so because of that, people just make the decision and move on. And there's kind of a reliance on that too. I get that. But it's same on this end of it as well, which is just like, I don't have the time to look into a potential claim. And it would have to be, then in order for it to sort of bump up in the order of priorities, then it would have to be monetary, weirdly, as an after thought, to sort of bump it up. So it's like, if you said to me, oh, we could probably get you a couple of grand, I'd be like, nah, no. But then if you turn around to me and said, well,
Greg,
actually,
you're a very tough customer.
well, I like to challenge my guests. But you see my point? Like, it is also about priorities, and not everyone's going to have a different set of them. And I think increasingly, in life's more complicated, life's more busy. If you have a lot of responsibilities, you're busy at work and so on, then it's going to be a tough sell to get someone to care about it, not just from that ethical and moral point of view, but also just from that point of view. I mean, I don't know how much time it would take to work on this, but I assume it's not zero. Right.
I think that's you're beautifully kind of setting up exactly what we found in the research, to be honest, which is,
it's like I've done these sort of conversations before, isn't it?
but it's very it is that tricky balance of, and that is again right back to why we always start with what the problem is, because if you're not hooked in on that, even if you were hooked in by the potential £10,000. As you say, bizarrely as it sounds, that isn't going to keep you kind of desperate to know the news in 2 years' time. Right. You're just going to be like, oh, that wasn't a thing, was it?
It's gone. Have to care whereas
if you've got if you really care about the issue, so it is about, but that alone, you then need to look at those kind of secondary sort of motivators, which could be about money, it's about seeing progress, etc., etc. But it's also about making things easy. So again, the sort of next big bit of feedback from consumers about this whole area is, oh, it's really complicated, it's really time consuming. Their perceptions are really complicated, really time consuming. Oh, no thanks, my life's busy enough, as you said. So it's also then about, which is our kind of point of being, look, we're the one place, so you can see the legit claims, they're all there. If you want to get involved, we'll let you know at the point at which you need to do something. So particularly with these big opt-out claims where they rumble on, for 3 or 4 years, hopefully, if they're successful at each point, and we just pop in your inbox and say, oh, okay, if you were interested in the Apple one or the Google one or the Amazon one, here's the latest. And then at the point at which it's like, hopefully, here's how you collect your money, it's going to be as simple as just going, click a few buttons, and it be then sent to you, etc., etc. But it's about then making that process, which again is really interesting with, when you're dealing with a court system that talks about how to distribute money and how to engage people, again, we're sort of saying, look, one of the big things, which is really, really great coming out from the court, is I don't want to see a settlement or a distribution process out to customers designed with no engagement from customers. So one of the things that we've been doing is also designing kind of research programs where we're saying, look, you need to research the whole thing, right down to like, what messaging would people respond to? How would they like to be paid? Because again, that really varies, across the world with different payment mechanisms. How would people expect to do it? How should the website look? All of those sorts of things to make sure that then the distribution has got the best possible chance of succeeding. And then obviously user testing the website to make sure that, people don't, what are people finding difficult? What bit of the legal jargon has made them stop and run away, and how do you keep iterating on that? And that is all really new for the kind of sector, because normally they're used to kind of having everything signed off by the court and this is the wording we must use. So we, again, having those sort of conversations. And I think, to be fair, the judiciary and the judges are really up for that. They're actually sort of coming back in their judgments, these very long judgments, very serious, but saying, I don't want to see a settlement, or I don't want to see this without seeing some original consumer research. So I think there's some really good practices kind of being baked in at the moment, but there's just so much more to do, and it will keep changing as well. So that's really exciting for me and Nikki, my business partner, Nikki Stockford. She's a trained researcher. So funnily enough, that, we kind of, we're sort of up on all of that, but also, it's the sort of driving motivation around the site, education, awareness, engagement, and making it easy,
I find it all very, very interesting. I mean, that's why I wanted to speak to you as well. Aside from finding you interesting, the topic itself is very interesting because, my sort of academic background was in sociology and psychology.
Okay.
So I find groupthink and individual think, but more groupthink especially, like an incredibly interesting thing. And that for me was sort of carried through into my consultancy work in sort of the way that people work together in teams and in companies and so on, and in groups, and when in communities and all that kind of stuff. I find that infinitely fascinating, and the whole subject is just one that I can read about and ponder on for a very, very long time. But then the other side of it is obviously my career in marketing and in sales, where to be honest, marketing is one of those things that I've kind of fallen more and more away from, because there's no one's really sort of actually taking new research, at least not in pockets, yes, but like really the general day to day, it's become kind of lazy. And there's not much innovation happening there. So what we're talking about here is quite interesting because it's kind of really it sounds to me like it's really sort of taking a newer approach to these things and thinking a lot more about them. But then on top of that, with another really important thing to me that I think that needs to be thought about more, which is sort of conscious capitalism, ethical considerations, moral considerations too, that's layered into it. So it is a really interesting topic, even from that perspective, as from not obviously, I know that there's the main crux of it, which is people might be getting screwed and they are owed compensation. But on top of it, there's all of these other bits that I find really, really interesting and fascinating.
They
But
are all part of it, as you say,
yeah,
the kind of big mix. And I think, for us that, there's many different sort of problems that we're trying to address, both from a kind of very macro, as you mentioned right at the start, the kind of access to justice point, that
right.
whole idea about the David and Goliath and all of that. It's all well and good to have these kind of mechanisms, but if nobody can use them, or they're only reserved for people with loads of money. I mean, you saw that with some of the hacking cases stuff where it's like, look, well, yeah, Prince Harry and various sort of lords can, which is great that they do that. But, really, we need a system where everybody can benefit, and so I'm really passionate about access to justice. But I also feel like increasingly kind of over my career in consumer advocacy, I spent decades lobbying for changes to the law, to new laws, to talking directly to businesses and getting them to change their practices. As you say, often, I know you say this a lot at which, problems were happening and it was cock up, not conspiracy, so, hey, just tapping someone on the shoulder and saying, look, this is the feedback we're getting, how do we fix it, did solve problems. Big companies can make big changes much quicker than any government
But
could do. So
sometimes they're just not aware of the scale of the problem that they caused, and so on.
Yeah, it's a lot of it. It's a bit like kind of misaligned sales incentives and things. Mis-selling of products often comes down to, a target was set. There's salespeople are entrepreneurial. They'll think of ways to reach that target, and nobody's thought about the unintended consequences of kind of pushing a product like PPI
Right.
that
Intention matters to some
yeah,
degree
exactly.
there.
And so there's kind of loads of things there but increasingly, that was sort of what I would call campaigning on behalf of people. So you were kind of going out and looking to sort of change the world on their behalf. Very grand. But actually, there's so much more that we can all do. And actually, people now kind of want to feel enabled to make change themselves and do things. And so increasingly, that I think is where consumer rights come in, where you say, look, there's just this brilliant suite of rights that we all have for our everyday lives that you just don't know about, that just need to be made easier. Often the companies, that the person you're speaking to in the shop or whatever doesn't know the rules. And it's like, how do you empower people to kind of go in and say, look, these are the rules, this is the thing, give me my money back. Because those everyday irritations are actually what are the drip that kind of really bug people, So one of the things I'm kind of passionate about is saying, look, how do you activate those? How do you make, people be able to access from very small things right up to big things, their own justice and, and feel like they're part of it as well? Because again, it's great. And I think a lot of, we're really fortunate in the UK to have organisations like Citizens Advice and others who are kind of out there in the background just doing all this stuff that, I was used to say when I worked at Which, it's like, nobody wants to be a full-time consumer. That's kind of me. And that's why I'm employed by Which to do that for them. But, there are certain bits and bobs that I think
we're all full-time consumers.
Yeah, we are. And,
Yeah.
And actually when it comes to to certain things, we kind of need, there isn't going to be a trading standards officer, unfortunately, being able to enforce every single engagement or, and now, they're so thin on the ground that we all need to be able to stand up for ourselves, which ultimately I guess we all kind of want to do as well. Like I take your point about, people are on a spectrum with that about what they will and won't sort of get exercised about. But I think there are sort of like basic things where we think, God, why am I paying so much for this subscription? Or what is going on with this energy bill? Or like the problem with this builder has now become like this absolute nightmare. And I kind of need to, I need to know where I stand with all of this. Again, part of what we try and do is make that really straightforward to understand and make sure that it's not in a kind of legalese way, but it is accurate and that you would be able to grasp it and you would be able to communicate confidently to somebody else. So again, it's like, how do you create tools to do that? How do you make sure that it's quick and easy, but people also understand what they're participating in?
Yeah, I think you touched on an important point there, kind of in some ways back to your original point about education, which is, I firmly believe, for example, that that all individuals should be made as aware as possible of their rights overall, right? Human rights, legal rights, etc. In most given circumstances. So whether that is, I don't know, say you're being, a traffic stop, or you've maybe been accused of a crime, or whatever it might be, you should have a broad understanding as a baseline. Every human being should have a broad understanding of what those rights are, and within that is consumer rights, because like we just said, everyone's a consumer, right? Just as everyone is a human. And so you should understand the rights associated with those things. I think there seems to be a big focus on rights for around the world, rightly or wrongly, whatever your stance is on it, for the extremes in societies, or even people that don't live in our country and live in other, like we see protests about and things like that. So, okay, fine, fight whatever fight you want to fight. But what's interesting is if you were to stop a lot of these people in the street and just ask them basic questions about their day-to-day rights, they wouldn't know how to answer that, or their opinion on it would be wildly inaccurate. And I think that is something a bit like, we often entrepreneurs talk about financial literacy in school, and, entrepreneurialism in school and things like that. There seems to be we're missing a trick in raising our kids and young adults to be somewhat aware of those rights. I think another one is like digital rights, for example, because once you educate people on these things, what you tend to find is that their sense of responsibility around them and how they treat others also improves, because they're not just learning about their rights, but they're also learning about the rights of others. And so then, as a result, you generally sort of get a more educated society, and a society that is, more respectful of one another and one another's rights. And so that's important, because, if you have young people that go on to create businesses and they understand that, they're not going to create businesses that go against consumer rights. You know what I mean? It just kind of it all trickles into one. So to bring in the kind of psychological aspect of it. But I did want to ask you about a couple of other things. But we're going to have to do that in part 2. I wanted to ask you about Web3 and crypto. I don't know if you know much about that space, but I definitely am curious to know what your thoughts might be on that. And open that up. AI as well, because there's definitely a lot going on in the consumer space there. I'd be interested to know about. And also, I haven't even had a chance to sort of ask a bit about you, really. Which I normally do.
But on my soapbox about consumer rights.
Hey, I was loving it. I'm interested. So, but yeah, so we'll get into that in part 2. But that's the end of part 1 for now. So for those listening and watching, you're going to have to come back in a couple of days, subscribe, do all that stuff that you're meant to do, and jump in the comments and tell us what you think. Maybe you've had some experiences with this. So, I'd be really interested to know what people think of these ads if they've come across them. I'd be interested to know. That could be a nice little research section in the comments. So that's the end of part 1. Thanks very much for joining me. And for us, we're going to take a short break, but for you guys, you have to come back in a couple of days. End of part 1. Cheers.
Thank you for listening and or watching. Subscribe with notifications turned on to get notified when part 2 comes out. While you wait, please join in the conversation in the comments below.